So in Canada, when is employment income not subject to income tax or income tax exempt for First Nations Canadians? Well, in this video, I'm going to explain how that works. I think there is a misconception here where sometimes other Canadians think that those who are First Nations who have Indian status do not pay income tax, which is not the case. There are certain instances where First Nations people with Indian status do not have to pay income tax, but in a lot of cases they do. So I'm going to break that down in this video. And before I start, just to be clear, I'm talking about employment income tax. So income tax on earnings from employment when you're employed by someone else, like when you're actually on payroll. This is completely separate from sales tax like PST, provincial sales tax, and completely separate from GST, goods and services tax, which is a federal tax. And this is also completely separate from income tax on self-employment or business earnings. So when I say someone who's First Nations, this does not include Métis. This is someone who has legal Indian status. And before I get into the situations here where income tax can be exempt for those individuals, I also just want to add that it depends. There can be unusual, rare circumstances where these rules don't necessarily apply. There are exceptions to every rule, so I'm just going to read directly from the Canada Revenue Agency website. And so I would recommend reading the links that I'm going to add in the video description below so that you can see the examples and read word for word, because even though I'm going to be communicating this, I'm not the one who gets to make the decisions. Again, there are some rare exceptions or rare circumstances where these rules may not apply. So all that being said, how can employment income be exempt from income tax for First Nations individuals with formal Indian status? Well, there are 4 distinct guidelines that are laid out on the Canada Revenue Agency website, and I'm just going to read those and quickly review them. Okay, so the first guideline states, when at least 90% of the duties of an employment are performed on reserve, all of the income of an Indian from that employment will usually be exempt from income tax. And so for that first guideline, there are a few examples on the CRA website that you can read. But basically, if you have full Indian status and you're employed and 90% or more of the actual work that you're doing is located on reserve land, then typically your income is not subject to income tax. So you don't have to pay federal or provincial income tax. Now, in the case where it's not 90% or more, maybe it's kind of 50-50, your job requires you to work on reserve and off reserve, then in that case, you use a proration rule, meaning, if 50% of your work is on reserve and 50 is off, then 50% of your employment income is subject to tax, income taxes, and 50% is not subject to employment income tax. So again, there could be exceptions where these rules don't apply, but that is the first guideline on the CRA website. Now, the second guideline says when the employer is a resident on reserve and the Indian lives on reserve, all of the income of an Indian from an employment will usually be exempt from income tax. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that the individual employer lives on reserve, it's that the business is resident on reserve. So if that's a corporation and the office of the corporation is on reserve, or that's a sole proprietorship business where even if the owner doesn't live on reserve, but the business is located on reserve, that's what it means. And so if the individual working at that business, where the business is resident on reserve, and the individual working there has Indian status and lives on reserve, then in that case, typically their employment income is also not subject to income tax. And for that second guideline, just like the first one and the other 2, there are examples on the website. All right, so now guideline 3 says, when more than 50% of the duties of an employment are performed on reserve and the employer is resident on reserve or the Indian lives on reserve, all of the income of an Indian from an employment will usually be exempt from income tax. So in that case, that's pretty straightforward, where again, the business has to be resident on reserve. Again, that's could be separate from the actual owner of the business. It's where is the business actually, tagged to, where is it located? And if the majority of the employment work performed by the First Nations individual with Indian status are performed on reserve, regardless of where that individual actually lives. So you can also read the examples on the website there. And now guideline number 4, this one's a little bit longer. It says, when the employer is resident on reserve and the employer is an Indian band, which has a reserve, or tribal council presenting one or more Indian bands which have reserves, or an Indian organization controlled by one or more such bands or tribal councils, if the organization is dedicated exclusively to the social, cultural, educational, or economic development of Indians who, for the most part, live on reserves, and the duties of the employment are in connection with the employer's non-commercial activities carried on exclusively for the benefit of Indians who, for the most part, live on reserves. All of the income of an Indian from an employment will usually be exempt from income tax. So there are examples for that fourth guideline as well. And that one is maybe more for certain institutions, organizations that exist exclusively for the well-being of First Nations people who predominantly live on reserve. So this could be more common with certain, schools, institutions, kind of nonprofit organizations, things like that. So those are the main four guidelines that explain when a First Nations individual who has Indian status can have their employment income not subject to income tax. And I'll just repeat myself again, there can be exceptions, there can be rare circumstances. I don't get to decide, so I would say read over this page, and if you have questions, you can reach out directly to the CRA, and sometimes they have to make a ruling as well, just because there are rare or unusual circumstances. So anyways, hopefully this video was useful. Hopefully that made it a little bit more clear as to when employment income can be tax-free or not subject to tax, or income tax exempt, or however you want to say it, for that demographic of people. So if First Nations individuals who do have Indian status are working off of reserve land for a business that's not located on reserve land, there's no real connection with reserve land, then when it comes to income taxes for employment, their income is treated just like anyone else. There is no real special rules there. So in some form, typically the business has to be tied to reserve, and then oftentimes the individual either has to be living or working or conducting many of their responsibilities on reserve. And so this could be useful either if you are First Nations with Indian status, or if you already have employees who are, or if you're planning on hiring some, just to understand how this works. So this was kind of a long video, but hopefully useful. If you enjoyed the video and learned something from it, please click like, and feel free to check out my YouTube channel, where I currently have almost 300 videos that cover business management and business startup topics.